What's happening?
कोई VVIP आ रहा है मैडम, कोई VVIP आ रहा है.
Who is it? The very, very important person turns out to be a local legislator, Anwar Noorani.
Hello ji, namaste.
Taking the metro ride to apparently bond with the common man. I've read about him in the papers, how he runs a chain of private hospitals allegedly funded by the proceeds from an illegal Hawala racket.
How are you?
His restless eyes flit across the compartment and come to rest on me.
Hello, how are you, sister?
He flashes me a plastic smile.
If there are any local issues you wish to bring to my attention, please feel free to call me. Here, please take my card.
Here,
Hello, uncle.
status is not based on whether you wear Armani, drive a Mercedes, or wear a diamond ring. Your status is determined by how many rules you can break. It's true of Priya Kapoor, it's true of Gulati and his odious son Raja, and it's true of...
Sir, we need to go, sir. Time is up. Your car is waiting outside. Come.
Goodbye. God bless you all.
Sir, please. Side, please. Please let him through, sir. Sir, गाड़ी लेके आओ, please. गाड़ी लेके आओ.
That's when it hits me. Even if I wear a real diamond, people will assume it's a fake. And even if Priya Kapoor wears a fake diamond, people will think it's real. I realize in that moment that this ring will bring me nothing but pain.
So we're doing a special promotion in incident Shanti. Picture quality नहीं रहती है जो ये.
But if I return it now, I will be branded a thief.
So, can I...
Hello, police? I have some information. Oh, Raja sir, sorry, I didn't know you were here.
No, it's okay. Come.
Look, I want to apologize.
Eh?
For making such a fuss. I mean, I was the obvious suspect. I was with Priya Kapoor all day and I was...
You know, I don't think an apology will cut it.
Hmm?
How about a hug? Hey, come on here, don't be so shy. Oh. Oh, so the ice is finally melted, huh?
I guess so.
Hey, how about I take you out for a drink? Huh?
But I have to get back to work and...
Hey, don't worry about work, yeah. I'm the boss here.
Okay, I'll just get my things.
Okay, I'll be waiting. Oh, good evening, officers. Any news on the missing ring? Huh? No. What?
Hands against the wall, Jal.
Wait. Listen to me.
Please be quiet, sir. Please be quiet. Just
Search him.
Why are you searching me? I'm the owner of the showroom.
What is this? Huh? What is
No. I don't know how that happened.
Staff gather at the back door to see what all the commotion is. We watch as Raja is handcuffed and bundled into a police jeep. The next day, it's on the front page of every newspaper. Wayward son of electronics retailer steals actress's diamond ring. On the train home, I can't stop smiling. I feel a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. But then... Hello?
Sapnasina,
Yes?
please hold. I have Mr. Ajay.
Congratulations. You have passed the third test. Test of integrity.
Are you
You
setting
may
up
be
this?
asking yourself if these tests are staged by me or my
Hello?
associates.
Hello?
What I would say in reply is that it's life that deals the cards and you play the hand. I am merely the croupier who announces the results. I apologize for the impersonal nature of this message. Business takes me beyond reach. Congratulations.
If what I did counts as integrity in the world of business, I know now I want no part of it. I must fail the next test. I really must.
And you can hear episode 5 tomorrow when Jane will be discussing what's the best way to talk to children about attending a protest. We'll hear advice for parents and of course the concern around safety. Candice Braithwaite will discuss what it's like to be a black British mother and why she's called her book I Am Not Your Baby Mother. And Jane talks to the Iranian filmmaker Mina Kashavarz about her new documentary, The Art of Living in danger. So do join Jane tomorrow morning if you can, 10 from me for today. Bye-bye.
Woman's Hour was presented by Jenny Murray and produced by Louise Corley. The studio engineer was Giles Aspin. In Uzbekistan, life in the countryside still goes on, much in the way it used to, except that at family gatherings, greetings which involved repeated kisses on each cheek are not happening, with new social distancing rules, much to the relief of our correspondent. Find out why there's relief in a couple of minutes.
What can a video assistant referee tell us about the world?
What I find fascinating about VAR is how it perfectly encapsulates many wider 21st century preoccupations.
Examining uncertainty in uncertain times.
You know, we live with uncertainty as part of being human.
The journalist Tom Chivers investigates.
The trouble is, when the information we get to assess the uncertainty around us is skewed.
What does the VAR experience tell us about how we should all deal with uncertainty?
There's a great saying by Voltaire, doubt is uncomfortable, but certainty is absurd.
Life, uncertainty and VAR, tomorrow morning at 11 on BBC Radio 4.
BBC News at 11 o'clock. New figures have laid bare the major disruption to cancer care in England during the pandemic. The number of people being assessed by a specialist within 2 weeks of a GP referral fell to 79,500 in April, down 60% on the same month last year. The cancer specialist, Professor Carol Sikora, has said he knew that there would be a drop, but not that it would be as big as this.
60% is a very significant drop, and that's because partly people are too frightened to come forward to symptoms to go to their GPs, and secondly, poor old GP, he's stuck with the patient and the diagnostic service has collapsed. He can't get an endoscopy or a scan because everything was shut because the NHS moved into COVID and did incredibly well.
The number of people going to A&E in England last month was down 42% compared with a year ago. That's smaller than the record drop in April. The owner of British Gas, Centrica, has said it will cut 5,000 jobs this year as part of efforts to slim the business and cut down on bureaucracy. Elsewhere, 2,500 roles are to go at the London-based manufacturing giant Johnson Matthey over the next 3 years. It supplies car parts and has taken a hit during the pandemic. The government says it's sticking to the 2-metre social distancing rule, but will keep it under constant review. Ministers have been coming under pressure to relax the measure to allow more schools and businesses to reopen. The former Conservative leader Ian Duncan Smith says the economy is facing a complete crash unless the rules are eased.
If we don't get the economy moving, we will be unable to afford any of the things that we need to support the public services. If we'd had a 1 or 1.5 metre rule for schools, it would have made it much, much easier for them to have opened. So it is the critical component around which everything coming out of lockdown hinges.
It's emerged that some high-risk offenders in England and Wales may not have been monitored as closely as they should have been during the lockdown. The details are contained in an internal Ministry of Justice document seen by BBC News. More details from our Home Affairs correspondent, Danny Shaw.
At the start of the lockdown, probation officers scaled back face-to-face supervision of thousands of sex offenders and violent criminals. Instead, plans were drawn up for most of them to be contacted by phone or visited on their doorstep. But in one 4-week period to May the 17th, only around half of high-risk offenders under supervision had all the contact that had been planned for. The Ministry of Justice statistics also show that during 1 week, almost 1 in 5 high-risk prisoners did not have immediate appointments with probation officers on release. The National Probation Service said the figures were unreliable, insisting that supervision was adequate.
And the makers of Marmite have been explaining why shoppers can't find larger jars of the spread. The company says the product relies on brewer's yeast, which is in short supply because beer production has been cut back. BBC News.
We'll celebrate the music and method of the composer Max Richter in half an hour here on Radio 4. But first, a trip around the world. Here's Katy with From Our Own Correspondent.
What can a video assistant referee tell us about the world?
Now, the astute listener will have noticed that's Diana Speed. This is Katy.
Good morning. Today, the stories our correspondents tell is of life almost everywhere in some way affected by the pandemic. Not surprisingly, in Yemen, fraught with civil war, the virus has added to their not inconsiderable troubles. And in Singapore, there may have been a relatively efficient handling of infection, but a pizza restaurant owner is counting the personal cost. Elsewhere, the old problems such as extremist violence are still around to thwart the tourist business. We hear from Mali. And then in a remote village in Uzbekistan, we find ourselves breathing a sigh of relief for social distancing. You don't have to kiss every relative several times at every family gathering. First to Minnesota, where their methods of policing have come under global scrutiny following the death of George Floyd. Killed by a policeman kneeling on his neck, there are now moves proposed by the Democrats to reform policing nationwide. There's wider recognition that police tactics that are now being outlawed have been disproportionately used on African Americans. Joe Erickson, who's black and originally British, moved to Minneapolis a few years ago and experienced its policing firsthand.
My hands were shaking. Panic left me paralyzed and glued to the car seat. I thought, he's going to shoot me. Authorities had just announced that no police officer would be charged in connection with the fatal shooting of an unarmed black man. I was talking to black teenagers in North Minneapolis, a mostly African-American poor neighborhood with a history of police violence. I had just moved to the United States from Britain, and this was the first time I'd walked the streets of this particular hood. It wasn't how I imagined it to be. I was expecting high-density housing, rows and rows of tower blocks similar to the estates in inner-city London. What I found is that I parked up and checked my recordings. As I was listening, a police officer tapped on the car window. He asked me what I was doing, but reacting to nothing I'd done, he suddenly shouted, "Put your hands on the steering wheel. I need to see your hands." My adrenaline kicked in, and I was immediately conscious that if I moved, it could be misinterpreted. Then he placed his hand on his gun, which really scared me. There was another officer standing behind the car, and I felt like everything was getting out of control. I was too scared to talk. I was too scared to move. I was gripped with fear. Growing up in the UK, I was taught not to be afraid of the police. Here in Minneapolis, the cops are closed off from communities of colour. They drive around the city and few walk the streets. People fear them. The incident ended as quickly as it started, when he spotted my digital recorder, my microphone, and my journalist ID around my neck. He waved me on my way. That was 4 years ago. Since then, I've covered several fatal shootings of black men, but covering the death of George Floyd, handcuffed, pleading for air as a white officer kneeled on his neck, brought it all back. Being a journalist of colour is a double-edged sword. It can give you access into hard-to-reach communities, but it also means that you're not immune from racial profiling. During the recent riots in Minneapolis, black CNN correspondent Omar Jimenez was arrested during a live broadcast by Minnesota State Patrol officers in riot gear. No white members of the press were arrested during the riots. Police departments across the state of Minnesota do attempt to screen out candidates who might behave in a way unfit for a police officer. 5 years ago, Minneapolis implemented a reform program and screenings to weed out undesirables. The state's peace officer standards and trainings boards require prospective cops to undergo a psychological evaluation and an interview to determine whether they are suitable to become officers. But these reforms